We're kicking things off today by looking at Humanity and Inclusion, a global charity working alongside disabled and vulnerable people in 60 countries affected by poverty, conflict, and disaster. One of the main countries they work in is Ukraine. We're joined in the studio now by producer Adelaide Posman-Ponte and Francis Durnley, co-hosts of Ukraine the Latest. They recently went to Ukraine to see Humanity and Inclusion in action. Welcome, Adelaide and Francis. Adelaide, the choice of this charity was very personal, not just to a lot of us in the team, but particularly to you. Can you tell us a bit about why the Telegraph selected Humanity and Inclusion?
Yes, so Humanity and Inclusion was chosen by David Knowles over the summer. David was obviously the host and the creator of Ukraine the Latest, our daily show on the war in Ukraine. And David had been very keen for several months to get a Ukraine-focused charity in the Christmas appeal at the Telegraph. And I know he'd been mulling it over and eventually settled on Humanity and Inclusion, which he pitched to management. Sadly, just a week before he died, he passed away at 32 at the beginning of September from a very sudden heart attack. David was my colleague, our colleague, Francis's co-host, who is also my partner in life outside of the office. So obviously this came to an incredible shock to us all. It's the end of an era for Ukraine the Latest. I think we're all very shaken that he's not here to see the negotiations starting, that he won't see the end of the war, which we've been talking so much about. For me personally, it's obviously the end of, the promise of a life together. That has also ended. But it was very important to us to have Humanity and Inclusion as part of the Christmas charity appeal for that reason. Obviously, Humanity and Inclusion focuses on vulnerable people close to the front lines around the world, but especially we're fundraising for Ukraine. So they help the elderly, people with disabilities, people who cannot leave their houses, who need social and medical support where they are. And that is very much in line with the work David has done when he was alive, really reporting and focusing on the human cost of war. So it's really important for us to continue that and to do that in his memory.
Yeah, really important in David's memory. What a remarkable colleague he was. And we want to make sure that not only our support for Humanity and Inclusion, but also for the podcast as well, is in that memory. Francis, could I come to you? You were both recently, Adelaide and you were both recently out in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, reporting on the vital work Humanity and Inclusion do. Take us through what you saw there.
Well, Kharkiv is a frontline city, and it's only about 30 kilometres from the Russian border and is under constant bombardment. Every 4 hours or so, you'd hear an air raid siren going off in the middle of the night as well. And when you're walking around the city, one that once had a population of about 1.5 million, it's now sparsely populated. Many of the buildings are destroyed, and you can see the thousands upon thousands of windows that have been shattered by missile strikes. So this is a population that has endured so much over the past almost 3 years now, and we were very keen, for the reasons that Adelaide's just laid out, to see the work of Humanity and Inclusion and the vulnerable people who really are desperate in that situation of being under constant bombardment, or indeed having lived in the occupied territories that were later liberated by the Ukrainians in that first major counteroffensive in the second half of 2022. And some of the testimony that we heard out there was absolutely horrific, and you'll hear some shortly from one lady who was experiencing, I think, some of the most traumatizing experiences you can experience, particularly in old age. But we were also very keen to speak as well to the volunteers who are out there and doing this hard work. And it is hard work. We travelled with a group of volunteers for Humanity and Inclusion, many of them Ukrainian. And to get to some of the villages where they are operating, which is very near the front, it takes hours because the roads are not looked after. I mean, there are bad potholes in Britain. Let me tell you, the potholes in Ukraine are on a whole different scale altogether. It takes hours to get to some of these places. And so we wanted to see the people who were being supported. So not only those who have suffered so much, but also those who are doing the hard work day in, day out to get them the support that they need.
Well, we met two very lovely ladies, Tatiana and Vera. They're both in their late 60s, early 70s, and they were both living very close to the Russian border, have had to leave their houses. Tatiana was so motherly and caring towards us when we were coming here to interview her. She was the focus of our day and to hear about her experience, but she insisted on us staying for tea after the interview, and she'd made some brioches with sugar that she insisted we take them all back with us. It was also incredible to see, what the efforts that they have made to rebuild their lives. Tatiana in particular, who had seen some very horrible war crimes, was really sad that when she fled her home, she had to leave all of her farm animals behind. And she'd managed to find some chickens and find some geese and find some goats, which brought her a lot of joy, but also were a very important part of her survival. So seeing them in the houses they now inhabit and looking at their efforts to just make their lives as normal and as pleasant as possible, but also all of the efforts that go into surviving day in and day out, and how much humanity and inclusion is doing for them to have a livable life, was incredibly moving.
Let's hear a clip of your interview with Tatiana, which we voiced in English. She told you about one of the darkest moments of her time under bombardment by the Russians while she was living in this village close to the Russian border. Just a warning that what she described is graphic.
There was a terrible episode on April 26th. A neighbour of mine was living with me in the basement with his wife. Sometimes there were 8 of us in the basement, but mostly just us 3. And one day he was sitting outside smoking, because I didn't allow smoking in the basement. There wasn't enough air anyway. He was smoking homegrown tobacco in his pipe, and I suddenly had a feeling. I shouted at him, "Come into the basement!" And then a shell landed. I look out, and a quarter of his head is gone, but his eyes are still looking at me, and he's twisting that pipe, I swear to God. I covered him with a towel that was nearby, and then I wrapped him in a carpet. He lay with us like that for 3 days under the basement door.
What can one say when you hear testimony like that? And I should add, Kamal, if I may, that there's so much talk at the moment about negotiations and ceasefires and about compelling the Ukrainians essentially to concede territory in order for that peace to be lasting. But I think what we saw out there and what this kind of testimony offers is what that actually means in practice for people who live under the occupation. We're talking about people who have suffered immensely under the Russians, and Tatiana told us about actually being physically beaten by the soldiers that moved in there prior to her being liberated. And so I would just say, remember that when we're talking about negotiations, it's a friendly word, it sounds good, ceasefire, brilliant. But what that means is millions of people being signed away their lives into bondage.
Now, another of the people you spoke to was Illia. He is actually a humanity and inclusion volunteer. He lives in Poltava, a city near Kharkiv that became a hub for refugees fleeing Russia's advancing forces.
Poltava is a city with 300,000 population. After this, it's become a city of 500 or 600,000 people. The city was full of traffic jams, full of people on the streets, because many organizations were providing assistance. And when you were walking in the city center, you could see that here is the queue of people, here is queue of people. So you could see impact that all this has on the city.
So talk to me a little bit more about the day-to-day work of trying to help these people. So they arrive into a town, into an oblast that is not prepared infrastructurally for that number of people. What do you do? What is the literal step-by-step process of when these people arrive? Talk me through it.
When these people arrived, we were trying to find for them accommodation. People were searching for a safe place in Poltava.
Were you particularly unusual as being as young as you were when you started volunteering? You must have been not much older than 19, 20. Was that typical?
it's not so typical. Of course, I met other people who were my age volunteering, but mostly it was people starting from 20 years, but I started volunteering when I was 18 years old.
And so obviously you were a student. All of a sudden you're being thrust into a full-time job, as it were, as a volunteer. Were you sad to give up your studies?
I didn't give up my study. I continued it during evenings, or sometimes I was joining online classes when we were visiting rural areas. For the first year, I think we had only online. So I kept my study and I finished it.
Illia was an incredible person to meet. He was 20 or 21 years old. When the war broke out, he was an 18-year-old law student, as he said. And he just went into the streets, realised there were people to help, realised there was work to do, and just started working as a volunteer. And it's now his full-time job. He finished his studies on night courses after days, hours registering people in rural areas around Kharkiv, people who had fled their homes, people who were incredibly distraught and who had seen horrible, horrible things. And yet he was there. He's got this full-time job. He speaks incredible English, which he's just learnt from, working in Ukraine, just reading books and everything. He is an incredibly joyful kid, really, who should be at university having fun with his friends, and yet he's doing this incredibly important work, and he's seen his life and the world that he's grown up in completely, overtaken by the war in the span of 2.5 years. He was about to go home to his mother, I think with a bag full of dirty laundry, to be fair, like any 21-year-old, and was really looking forward to going horseback riding with his friends when we met him for the interview. And it was just this weird moment when war and all of that violence and all that upheaval becomes embodied in one person. The youthfulness, the energy, the joyfulness, and the, just of being a young man, and yet all that responsibility and all that sadness that has come over him and that he's had to shoulder for the last 3 years alongside everyone else in that area. It was quite incredible to see.
And I should say, I asked him at the end of the interview whether he would want to go back to being a lawyer, or whether this experience of helping so many people, whether that would be something that he'd want to make his career out of. And he said that very much this was something that he thought that he would do probably for the rest of his life.
Francis and Adelaide, thank you so much for bringing those people to life for us and showing the real impact of war. Do listen to Ukraine the Latest to get the latest of your reporting, but also the whole team on Ukraine the Latest. And you can also read more about the work done by Humanity and Inclusion, as well as Francis and Adelaide's reporting from Kharkiv on the Telegraph's website. A reminder of the other charities we are supporting: Alzheimer's Research UK, Teenage Cancer Trust and Army Benevolent Fund. To donate to any of them, please visit telegraph.co.uk/2024 appeal or call 0151 317 5247.